It's the mini discs and the controller. That's it. Everything else was either fine or great. Okay, maybe we need a better explanation. When I made the 5 big problems N64 video, I ended up making a lot of people think that I hated the Nintendo 64, or that I hated Mario or Nintendo or something. I don't. But that did bring up an interesting perspective I didn't really think of while making it. People will assume you hate something if you critique it, which I really don't agree with. If I really dislike something, like, I don't know, NBA 2K whatever, I won't be bothered enough to do the research required to be a professional hater. I don't even know what the latest NBA 2K game is. But if I like something, like the Sega Saturn, I'll dig into its flaws that I wish it didn't have, because I'd want it to be better. And generally, I like basically almost every single console on the market that's unique in some way. So the Gamecube. To go over how close the Gamecube was to success, we need to go over the hardware first. The CPU was a 486MHz PowerPC Gecko CPU. It had some pretty advanced features that were way too in-depth for this video, but overall, it was very modern and pretty damn fast. The GPU was an ATI chip called the Flipper. It ran at 162MHz, but it wasn't just a GPU, it was basically an entire system on a chip, a North Bridge. The CPU could talk to the RAM over the North Bridge, where it could access 24MB of T1 SRAM and 16MB of SDRAM, while the GPU itself had 3MB of T1 SRAM embedded in the SoC. And you may notice that the memory architecture is unified, but this time it isn't bad. I'll elaborate later. The console also featured 2 serial ports, 2 memory card ports, 4 controller ports, the disc controller, a video and audio coder engine, both for digital and analog outputs, and that's basically it. So, to elaborate on the architecture, a big issue with the unified memory layout is memory speed. Unified memory can work if your RAM is fast. The problem is that the Nintendo 64's RAM just wasn't. So Nintendo thought, yeah, let's actually make this work. So now the CPU and GPU have their own little memory spaces. The CPU has a memory mapping unit. The GPU has its own dedicated 3MB of embedded memory, which lets it read stuff like the frame buffer and such. And the GPU controls all the RAM and the I/O and such, which the CPU will access over the SoC. The RAM itself is split into 2 banks of memory, 16MB of very fast RAM, and 16MB of comparatively slower RAM. The 24MB of RAM was the main system memory, while the 16MB of RAM was slower to access and so was limited to less critical tasks. Thanks to the MMU, Nintendo released some libraries that could extend the main 24MB of RAM into the 16MB of RAM. Basically, the CPU could page data and memory stuff into the 16MB of ARAM, and they could use it as a page file on a modern Windows PC. To also clarify, the ARAM stands for Audio RAM, and this memory space was originally meant to be used for storing audio samples, although those can also be just streamed from the minidisc. Graphics-wise, the GPU has only 3MB of dedicated RAM, but that is still more than enough. It's split between a 1MB texture cache, a pretty big improvement from the 4KB, and a 2MB Z buffer and frame buffer combo. While the 3MB of RAM did seem quite small, it turns out that the 3 most memory-intensive features in terms of transfers are specifically texture data, Z buffer data, and the frame buffer. And all 3 of these are done on the internal fast dedicated RAM that the GPU has exclusive access to, while the GPU can access the main memory for everything else. The GPU in the Gamecube was still fixed function, which means it was harder to do things not already programmed in, while GPUs nowadays are basically entirely programmable. So overall, the console was faster than the PlayStation 2 by quite a bit, right? Or was it? No, it was. In Resident Evil 4, Leon himself had more polygons on the GameCube than the entire scene in the PS2 version. I'll link a video in the description that shows you just the version differences, and dear god, it's incredible. It's like the Wii port of a 360 game. So why did the GameCube sell worse than Nintendo 64? There were no crippling hardware issues that kept the games from looking as nice as they did, except Nintendo just had to use the worst fucking mini-discs known to man. They had to use 1.5 gigabytes per disc. They were horrendous considering a single layer DVD was 4.7 gigs and a dual layer one was 8.5 gigs of space. Hell, they could have even fit a proper full-size DVD player into the GameCube without changing anything. They just didn't for some godforsaken reason. And that's not the end of it. You'd think Nintendo would learn from other companies, but no. The GameCube controller just had to look the way it does. You can't click on the sticks and the C-stick is tiny, there's no left shoulder button, there's no select button, and the face button layout is terrible on most things you play on it. Okay, I'm done. Alright, so let's now gush about how the GameCube's graphics actually looked. I mean, seriously? The graphics looked way better than the PS2 by a long shot, and this competed with a ton of Xbox games for visuals. And this is kind of the issue, right? Like, I mean, compare Halo to Metroid Prime, I'd argue Prime looks better. And some of the best looking games on this generation came on the GameCube, and that's just that. And of course, if they actually used DVDs, they could have fixed nearly everything. A big reason for the PS2's success is the fact that it wasn't priced that much higher than a DVD player, and worked as one at a time when everyone wanted a DVD player. They did the same thing with the PS1 and CDs, and the PS3 with Blu-rays, even if Blu-rays didn't have the same impact. Maybe that's why they didn't sell as well. Nintendo obviously didn't, and instead, they took all the correct lessons from the Nintendo 64 generation, except the two big ones everyone who isn't a massive nerd thinks of: the controller and the media format the game comes on. Like, I know I'm not supposed to be mad, but it just pisses me off more than the Nintendo 64. Nintendo were just so unimaginably fucking close to making something perfect. But no, they just had to screw up in two segments that would have taken extremely little engineering to fix. Hell, if they used discs that were a little larger than standard DVDs, they could have stopped piracy, because the games would have not only been too large, like, I don't know, let's say 5.5 gigabytes in size, so you couldn't burn them onto a standard DVD, but also, the disc format itself wouldn't even be able to fit inside of a proper DVD reader on a PC, so you couldn't rip the discs. And not only that, but because it's larger, you can still read DVDs and it could still work as a DVD player. So, yeah, there's no way of fixing it now. I mean, there is, you can mod it, but there's no way to go back in time as much as I wish I could. And plenty of people talk about how great the GameCube actually was, but they have no idea how close it was to actually selling. Also, if you're critiquing my controller complaints, you're just wrong. Like, there's no nice way of saying it. You either have Stockholm Syndrome or are just bandwagoning, and you may need some medical treatment in the form of, like, I mean, look at it. Overall, that's gonna be it. I'm sorry, I just get really mad when something is very close to being good, and then it fails. That's gonna be it from me, though. Bye-bye.